A quick recap of Nannie's previous murders is in order at the grave of her next victim, Frank Harrelson. At age 21, she killed 2 of her kids, after which her husband Charlie Braggs escaped. He left 1 child and his mother with Nannie, and after a very short time, she killed her in-law as well. Charlie came for his mom's belongings and left his eldest daughter with Nannie, a girl whom she actually took very kindly to. With her 2 children in tow, she moved back to the old Hazel farm and began working in the old linen mill, but rumors were probably spreading like wildfire about the number of people dying around her. Now, back in those days, to accuse even an obvious killer was impossible if she was a woman. So rather than meeting new boys at the thread mill, she started writing in the Lonely Hearts columns. This is where she met her next victim, R.F. Harrelson. And what's so fascinating about this is that he was buried in 1945 and still listed Nannie Doss, or Nannie Harrelson, next to him. And obviously, she wasn't buried here with him. She spent the rest of her life in jail. I have a policy of not defaming people at their grave sites, so I'll do my best to sanitize the kind of man that Frank was. Most reports say he was fairly emotionless and had a bad drinking habit. When Prohibition ended, he switched from hooch to whiskey, which he still kept buried in his garden out of habit. Nannie and Frank were both cheating. Frank would leave on benders for days at a time, and Nannie was in the Lonely Hearts columns again. This continued for an amazing 16 years. However, it wasn't Frank that triggered Nannie's murderous rage, but her favorite daughter Melvina, who had 2 children in quick succession. She killed one of them, who's buried next to Frank. And this is the story of Little Robbie. In fact, before little Robbie Lee Higgins was killed, Nannie may have, keyword may have, murdered Melvina's other child in the hospital room. She felt that having 2 children would ruin her daughter's chance at romance, and the baby mysteriously died while she was holding it alone immediately after it was birthed. Later, Melvina told her sister Florine that she had a nightmare in which her mother pushed a hat pin into the soft spot on the baby's head, and Florine confirmed that she saw Nannie with a, quote, careful expression of grief right after the death. She also said that she saw Nannie actually playing with a hat pin in the birthing room. Nannie was already in a killing mentality when her daughter Melvina gave her her surviving child, Robert, after their relationship fell apart. Very soon after, she poisoned Robert with cookies. Still, no suspicion ever fell on Nannie Doss from authorities. Robert, who's buried on the left, was the 3rd child to die on Nannie's watch, and that was on July the 7th. Shortly thereafter, on VJ Day, Frank, who had avoided the draft so far, forced himself on his wife after she rebuked his advances. Nannie went to the garden to plot her revenge when she happened across his jug of whiskey. Seeing this as a sign, she poured out some booze, replaced it with rat poison, and found her husband dead on the lawn in the morning. She quickly discovered that he had a sizable life insurance policy, so she began taking out Lonely Hearts ads all across the country and moving around, partly to evade authorities, who still suspected nothing. After the highly suspicious deaths of 3 of her husbands and the murders of many children whom she saw as nothing more than a minor inconvenience, Nannie's family tracked her down. She was living in North Carolina alone after murdering another husband. Rather than question her, the family begged her to come and visit her sister. "Oh, won't you please come and see your dearest Dovey, who has a wasting disease." Dovey lasted only 1 week before she told Nannie she had constipation. In a signature move for her sister, Nannie baked stewed prune pie to help, but she had actually used the prunes to mask the flavor of arsenic. At Dovey's funeral, she learned that her father-in-law, Hazel, was dead, and that the only surviving husband she had was in hiding, and that her daughters were afraid to speak to her. She was totally free, unfettered by family or personal relations, and seems to have enjoyed that freedom by moving to the Midwest in search of more husbands. And standing here, it's easy to imagine the tension at these funerals. After all, her husband, Frank Harris, is buried there, and her granddaughter, Robbie, is buried right next to him, and her sister is buried right here. And I think that if Nannie had stayed a free woman, she probably would have been in this plot as well. In this cemetery is buried the man who made a giggling granny out of poor young Nannie. James Frank Hazel and his abuse reveal a lot about the nature of sexuality in the poorest parts of the American South in the early 1900s. Nannie was born in 1905 to a local woman named Lou, maiden name unknown, and a GI based in Anniston, Alabama. The soldier quickly ran off, leaving Lou a single mother, about the worst thing you could be as a white woman in Alabama in 1905. So Lou looked for partnership and quickly found one in James Hazel, who set the stage for Nannie's psychopathic behavior. What's so odd about James is that he treated his own children from a previous marriage okay, if cordially. Nannie, however, he couldn't stand, and all the kids he viewed as free labor. They toiled on his 3-acre dirt farm while James's cousins and uncles molested Nannie. In fact, James beat his family nearly to death when he found them touching his biological daughters, but offered up Nannie instead. And when he found Nannie getting molested twice, he beat her, saying she shouldn't have been so flirtatious with his uncle. At the time all this abuse was happening, Nannie was younger than 10 years old, and James would schedule his sex so that Lou wouldn't miss plowing his fields by being pregnant. In fact, he calculated that he'd need 5 kids to break even and make a profit on the farm, and that's exactly how he viewed his marriage. He calculated when he'd have sex, he calculated how many kids he'd have, and there was no emotion involved. Naturally, this set the stage for Nannie's later behavior. The Hazel kids, who only went to school in winter, were ruthlessly bullied and very poor socially. You can see why. So Lou handed Nannie a romance novel to read along the train ride, and that very same trip, the train launched forward and she hit her head. She had, from that point on, an obsession with romance novels, headaches, and violent outbursts of anger, which lasted her for the rest of her life. After the train ride, Nannie found that she no longer feared the violence of her stepfather, James, because, so she said, she always hurt now. She was always in pain. And to get away, she took a job at the thread mill in town when she was just 15. A year later, she married her first husband, Charlie Braggs. She would go on to kill 2 of his children and drive him into hiding. So I'm looking for the grave here of Nannie's stepfather, and she actually isn't buried in this cemetery, and she died decades later, but perhaps Nannie Doss is related.